In the darkest chambers of history, where the sacred and the profane dance together in shadows cast by flickering candles, there exists a tale so macabre, so steeped in the poison of human ambition, that even the most seasoned chroniclers of mankind's follies find themselves trembling as they set quill to parchment. This is the story of a pope who dragged the rotting corpse of his predecessor from its consecrated grave and forced it to stand trial. Before God and man, a grotesque spectacle that would forever stain the hallowed halls of the Vatican with the blood of vengeance and the stench of political hatred. The year was 897, when the world teetered on the edge of a new century, and the old order crumbled like ancient parchment in the flames of ambition. Rome itself was a city of shadows where marble columns stood, sentinel over streets that ran red with the blood of factional warfare, and where the very stones seemed to whisper of conspiracies that festered in the hearts of princes and prelates alike. Into this cauldron of corruption stepped Stephen VI, a man whose soul had been forged in the fires of resentment, and whose every breath was drawn in service to a hatred so pure, so absolute, that it would drive him to commit acts that defied both heaven and earth. Stephen VI was not born to hatred, though it would consume him utterly. He had risen through the ecclesiastical ranks with the calculated precision of a spider weaving its web, each thread carefully placed to ensnare his prey. His eyes, those who knew him said, were like chips of winter ice reflecting light, but holding no warmth and when he smiled, which he did often in those days before his ascension to the papal throne. It was with the cold satisfaction of a man who had already glimpsed the destruction of his enemies. Yet beneath this facade of clerical composure burned a fury that would not be quenched until it had consumed not only the living, but the very dead themselves. The object of Stephen's obsession was Formosus, a pope whose very name meant beautiful, but whose legacy had become a weapon in the endless wars that raged between the great houses of medieval Italy. Formosus had died the previous year, passing from this world in what observers believed to be natural circumstances. His final breath, drawn in the same chambers where he had wrestled with the impossible demands of temporal power and spiritual authority. But death, as Stephen would soon demonstrate, was no refuge from the vengeance of mortal men, and the grave offered no sanctuary from the bitter politics that poisoned the very air of Rome. To understand the depth of Stephen's hatred, one must first comprehend the labyrinthine politics that had shaped his world. Formosus had committed what Stephen viewed as the ultimate betrayal, siding with Arnulf of Carinthia against the Spellitan faction that had nurtured Stephen's own rise to power. It was a decision that had rippled through the corridors of influence like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves of consequence that would ultimately drag both living and dead into their destructive embrace. When Formosus chose to crown Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor, he had signed his own posthumous death warrant, though he could never have imagined the grotesque form that his punishment would take. The morning of January 897 dawned gray and cold over Rome, as if the very heavens had drawn a shroud over the city in anticipation of the horror that was to unfold. In the depths of St. Peter's Basilica, where countless pilgrims had knelt to pray, and where the bones of martyrs lay in hallowed rest, Stephen VI had ordered preparations for a trial unlike any the world had ever witnessed. The great hall was transformed into a tribunal with witnesses, summoned from across the papal states to bear witness to what would become known to history as the Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod, though those who lived through it would remember it simply as the day the Church itself seemed to descend into madness. As dawn broke and the bells of Rome told their mournful song across the 7 hills, a procession unlike any other made its way through the streets toward the basilica. At its center, carried on a simple wooden bier, like a grotesque parody of a royal cortege, was the exhumed corpse of Formosus, his flesh already surrendering to the inevitable decay that claims all mortal remains. The body had been hastily dressed in the papal vestments of office, the rich silk and gold thread serving as a mockery of the dignity they were meant to convey, while the stench of death mingled with the incense that the terrified priests scattered in their wake like protective charms against the evil they were being forced to witness. Those who saw the procession would carry the image with them to their own graves. For there was something profoundly wrong in the sight of that decaying form, clothed in the regalia of Christ's vicar on earth. Children fled weeping to their mothers' skirts, while grown men crossed themselves and whispered prayers for protection against whatever demons had possessed their Holy Father to commit such an abomination. Even the hardened Roman guards, men who had seen the worst that human cruelty could devise, found themselves unable to look directly upon the spectacle, their eyes drawn inexorably to the corpse before darting away in horror. Inside the basilica, Stephen VI waited with the patience of a predator preparing to strike. He had dressed himself in his finest robes for this moment, the gold and crimson fabric catching the light of 1,000 candles like drops of blood on burnished metal. His face was a mask of righteous fury, but those who dared to meet his gaze saw something far more disturbing than mere anger burning in his eyes. There was a madness there, a terrible clarity that comes to men who have stared too long into the abyss of their own hatred and found themselves staring back. The assembled clergy, summoned by papal decree to witness this unprecedented trial, filed into the hall like mourners at a funeral, their faces pale with shock and their hands trembling as they took their appointed places. Among them were men who had served both Stephen and Formosus, their loyalties torn between obedience to their current pontiff and their horror at what they were being commanded to witness. They moved like sleepwalkers, their minds struggling to comprehend the reality of what was about to unfold before their eyes. When the corpse of Formosus was finally brought into the hall and placed upon a throne facing Stephen's own seat of judgment, the very air seemed to grow thick with the weight of the sacrilege about to be committed. The body, held upright by hidden supports and positioned with the grotesque care of an undertaker preparing a corpse for viewing, presented a sight that would haunt the nightmares of every man present for the remainder of their days. The flesh had already begun its inevitable transformation, the skin taking on the waxy pallor of death, while the eyes, those windows to the soul, had become empty sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at his tormentor. Stephen VI rose from his throne with theatrical precision, his movements calculated to project the authority of his office, while his voice, when he began to speak, carried the weight of absolute conviction. He had appointed a deacon to serve as counsel for the accused, a young man whose face had drained of all color as the full horror of his assigned role became clear. This unfortunate soul would be required to speak in defense of a corpse, to give voice to arguments that the dead pope could no longer make for himself, while knowing that no earthly advocate could hope to prevail against the predetermined verdict that Stephen had already pronounced in his heart. The charges that Stephen leveled against the silent defendant were as politically motivated as they were legally dubious. He accused Formosus of perjury, claiming that the dead pope had lied under oath during his lifetime, though the specifics of these alleged falsehoods were never clearly established. More significantly, he charged Formosus with having illegally ascended to the papal throne, arguing that his previous tenure as Bishop of Porto disqualified him from assuming the broader authority of the papacy. It was a technical violation of church law that had been overlooked by necessity during Formosus's lifetime, but which now provided Stephen with the legal framework he needed to justify his grotesque proceedings. As Stephen spoke, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of a prosecutor laying out his case. Before a jury, the assembled clergy listened in stunned silence to accusations being hurled at a man who could offer no defense save the eloquent silence of the grave. The deacon appointed to speak for Formosus made what feeble arguments he could, his voice barely above a whisper, as he attempted to defend actions taken by a man who could no longer explain his motivations or justify his decisions. It was a performance as futile as it was tragic, a legal pantomime played out before an audience of horrified witnesses who dared not protest for fear of sharing the accused's fate. The trial proceeded with the inexorable momentum of a nightmare, each accusation falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples of horror that spread outward to encompass every soul present. Stephen presented witnesses who testified to Formosus's alleged crimes, though their words carried the hollow ring of testimonies extracted through fear rather than sworn in pursuit of truth. Documents were produced and read aloud, their Latin phrases, echoing through the hall like incantations in some dark ritual, while the accused sat in perfect stillness. His decomposing form, a grotesque reminder of the ultimate futility of all earthly ambitions. As the hours passed and Stephen's fury showed no signs of abating, the temperature in the great hall seemed to drop, as if the very presence of death had brought winter into the heart of the basilica. Candles flickered in draughts that seemed to come from nowhere, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made the gathered witnesses appear to writhe like tormented souls in some infernal painting. The smell of death, despite the clouds of incense that the terrified priests burned in increasing quantities, began to permeate the air, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to clothing and hair, and would linger in the nostrils of witnesses long after they had fled this accursed place. When Stephen finally called for the verdict, his voice had taken on the quality of a funeral bell, deep and resonant with the finality of judgment. The outcome had never been in doubt, for this was not a trial in any meaningful sense, but rather a theatrical production designed to legitimize a predetermined conclusion. The gathered clergy, their faces pale with horror and their voices barely audible, pronounced Formosus guilty of all charges, their words falling into the silence like clods of earth on a coffin lid. The punishment that Stephen decreed for his lifeless predecessor was as cruel as it was symbolic. All of Formosus's acts as pope were declared null and void, his papal bulls burned before his sightless eyes, and his appointments to church offices revoked with the stroke of a pen. But Stephen's vengeance demanded more than legal nullification. It required physical humiliation that would serve as a warning to any who might dare oppose his authority. The papal vestments were stripped from the corpse with hands that trembled with revulsion, revealing the decay that had already begun its work beneath the rich fabrics. The final act of this grotesque drama was perhaps the most shocking of all. Stephen ordered that the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, the fingers with which he had bestowed papal blessings and signed documents of state, be severed from his body and cast aside like refuse. It was a mutilation that served no practical purpose save to satisfy Stephen's need for symbolic revenge. A defacement of the dead that violated every principle of Christian burial and human decency. The sound of the blade cutting through bone and gristle echoed through the hall like the crack of thunder, and more than one witness was seen to collapse in horror at the sight. But even this was not enough to slake Stephen's thirst for vengeance. The mutilated corpse was to be denied the dignity of proper burial, instead being dragged through the streets of Rome like a criminal to the gallows. The body of the former pontiff, stripped of its vestments and bearing the marks of Stephen's cruel justice, was loaded onto a cart and paraded through the city, while Stephen's supporters jeered and threw refuse at the remains of a man who had once held the keys to heaven and earth. The procession made its way to the banks of the Tiber, that ancient river that had witnessed countless acts of human cruelty throughout its long history. There, on the muddy banks where fishermen cast their nets and children played in happier times, the corpse of Formosus was hurled into the brown waters like a piece of carrion to be devoured by the fishes. The splash as the body hit the water was lost in the general noise of the crowd, but those who were present would later swear that they heard in that sound the very gates of hell creaking open to receive a soul that had been denied the peace of proper rest. As Formosus's remains disappeared beneath the surface of the Tiber, carried away by currents that would bear him far from the city, where he had once ruled with authority second only to Christ himself, Stephen VI stood watching from the riverbank with the satisfaction of a man who had finally settled an old score. His face showed no trace of remorse, no flicker of doubt about the righteousness of his actions. In his mind he had delivered justice to a traitor and established his own authority beyond question. What he could not foresee was that his gruesome spectacle had set in motion forces that would ultimately destroy him as surely as he had destroyed his predecessor. The people of Rome, initially cowed by the display of papal power, began to whisper among themselves about what they had witnessed. In the markets and taverns, in the workshops of artisans, in the hovels of the poor, the story of the Cadaver Synod spread like a plague. carrying with it a growing sense of unease about the man who now claimed to speak for God on earth. How could a successor of St. Peter, they asked one another, commit such an abomination against the dead? What manner of hatred could drive a man to such extremes of cruelty that he would violate the very foundations of Christian burial and human decency? The answer to these questions would come sooner than Stephen might have expected, for his actions had not gone unnoticed by those with the power to challenge his authority. Among the Roman nobility, men who had initially supported Stephen's ascension began to question whether they had placed their trust in a madman, whose thirst for vengeance might eventually turn upon them. The very brutality that Stephen had intended as a demonstration of strength was increasingly seen as evidence of weakness, proof that the papal throne was occupied by a man whose judgment had been clouded by personal hatred rather than guided by divine wisdom. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, the political winds that had carried Stephen to power began to shift with the same capricious violence that characterizes all human affairs. The Roman populace, their initial shock giving way to anger, began to view their pope not as a strong leader, but as a dangerous fanatic, whose actions threatened the very foundations of their faith. Riots broke out in the streets, with crowds calling for Stephen's removal from office, while the clergy, who had been forced to participate in his grotesque tribunal, began to distance themselves from his increasingly erratic behavior. The end, when it came for Stephen VI, was as violent and sudden as the vengeance he had visited upon his predecessor. In August of 897, less than 8 months after the trial that had shocked Christendom, an angry mob of Romans stormed the papal palace and dragged Stephen from his throne. The man who had once commanded absolute obedience found himself stripped of both power and dignity, his papal vestments torn from his body by hands that showed no more reverence for his office than he had shown for the corpse of Formosus. He was imprisoned in the same dungeons where political prisoners had languished for centuries, and there, in the darkness and squalor that he had never imagined would be his fate. Stephen VI faced the same mortality that he had mocked in his treatment of the dead. His death came by strangulation, the life crushed from his throat by hands that may have belonged to supporters of Formosus or simply to Romans who had been sickened by the spectacle they had been forced to witness. Stephen VI died as he had lived in those final months of his reign, consumed by the very hatred that had driven him to commit his ultimate act of sacrilege. His body was afforded the proper burial that he had denied to Formosus, but his soul, if the chroniclers of the time are to be believed, found no peace in death, for he had violated laws both human and divine in pursuit of his personal vendetta. The Cadaver Synod stands as one of the most bizarre and disturbing episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. A moment when the pursuit of political power overcame every consideration of human decency and spiritual authority. It was a trial that satisfied no earthly justice and served no divine purpose, existing only as a monument to the depths of cruelty that can be reached when hatred is given free rein to express itself through the machinery of institutional power. The sight of that decomposing corpse, dressed in papal finery and forced to endure accusations it could neither hear nor answer, remains one of the most haunting images in the long catalogue of human folly. In death, both Stephen VI and Formosus found themselves united in a legacy of mutual destruction, their names forever linked, not by shared purpose, but by the grotesque spectacle that had bound their fates together across the boundary between life and death. The trial that Stephen had intended as a vindication of his authority instead became his epitaph, while Formosus, silent and still in death, achieved a kind of posthumous victory through the very horror that his treatment had inspired in all who witnessed it. The Cadaver Synod thus serves as a reminder that even in death men may find ways to destroy one another, and that the grave, contrary to the hopes of poets and the promises of philosophers, offers no guaranteed refuge from the endless wars that rage in the hearts of mortal men. The Gothic horror of that January day in 897 continues to cast its shadow over the centuries, a testament to mankind's capacity for cruelty that transcends even the boundary between life and death, leaving us to wonder whether the true horror lay not in the trial of a corpse, but in the living souls who stood by and watched as their spiritual father descended into a madness so complete that it would forever stain the throne of St. Peter with the blood of vengeance and the ashes of desecrated graves.